when you are subverting the power of government, that's a fundamentally dangerous thing to democracy.
What do you think of Edward Snowden?
I think he's a traitor. I think he has committed crimes, in effect, by violating agreements given the position he had. He was a contractor employee, but he obviously had been granted top secret clearance. And I think it's one of the worst occasions in my memory of somebody with access to classified information doing enormous damage to the national security interests of the United States.
We believe that Snowden is still in Hong Kong and apparently giving the Chinese information about alleged U.S. cyber hacking into Chinese computers. A couple of questions. Do you think he was a spy all along for the Chinese? Do you think he's using this information to try to buy asylum from the Chinese? And how firm should the U.S. government be with the Chinese about turning this guy back to us?
Well, I'm deeply suspicious, obviously, because he went to China. That's not a place where you ordinarily want to go if you're interested in freedom and liberty and so forth. So it raises questions whether or not he had that kind of connection before he did this. The other concern I have is whether or not he had help from inside the agency. That is to say, was there somebody else in NSA who had access to a lot of this stuff and passed it to him? That's presumably one of the things they'll look at in the course of the investigation. But I am very, very worried that he still has additional information that he hasn't released yet, that the Chinese would welcome the opportunity and probably willing to provide immunity for him, or sanctuary for him, if you will, in exchange for what he presumably knows or doesn't know. So it's going to be a continuing problem. I don't think this is just a one-off disclosure. I think there's a real danger here that he'll go beyond that. And I have trouble believing that somebody in his position as a contract employee had access to the kind of things he's talking about.
So you don't think he was acting alone?
I don't know. I think you have to ask that question.
Now, what about the U.S.-Chinese relationship? We saw President Obama meet with President Xi last weekend out in Palm Springs, supposedly trying to rebuild a relationship. How much should we put that relationship on the line to demand that they turn Snowden back to us?
Well, I think you need to be very aggressive about it. I'm not sure it'll do any good. It depends, obviously, on whether or not the Chinese believe he still has value from an intelligence standpoint. I've got to believe they'll work that angle first before they decide whether or not they're going to turn him over.
Since the leaks, there has been a lot of criticism of the NSA program from both the right and the left. I want to focus on conservatives, though, people like Senator Rand Paul, who say, fine, let the government target terrorists, but leave law-abiding Americans alone. Take a look.
This is what we objected to, and what our founding fathers partly fought the revolution over, is they did not want generalized warrants where you could go from house to house with soldiers looking for things, or now from computer to computer to phone without specifying who you're targeting.
Question, is Senator Paul wrong?
I believe he is. Two-thirds of the Congress today, Chris, wasn't here on 9/11 or for that period immediately after when we got into this program. And the reason we got into it was because we'd been attacked, and worse attack than Pearl Harbor. 19 guys armed with box cutters and airline tickets. The worry is that the next attack, and there were expected, we then expected, and I expect today, sooner or later there's going to be another attack, and they'll have deadlier weapons than ever before, that we've got to consider the possibility of a nuclear device or biological agent. We made the decision based on 9/11 that we no longer had a law enforcement problem, that we're at war. And Congress, in fact, authorized us, the President, to use military force to deal with that crisis. And that puts you over into the category of being able to use all of your military assets, your intelligence assets, and so forth in order to protect the country against another attack. And when you consider the possibility of somebody smuggling something like a nuclear device into the United States, it becomes very, very important to gather intelligence on your enemies and stop that attack before it ever gets launched.
But let me ask you the specific question that Rand Paul and a lot of other people on both the right and the left are raising. They're saying, fine, if you find the bad guys or you have a reason to suspect them, go after their numbers, go after their emails, but why do you have to vacuum up information on every law-abiding American in the country?
Well, first, what information? And the answer is phone numbers and who contacted who. But we don't have any names associated with it. It's just a big bag of numbers that have been collected. And
He still says that's an intrusion.
well, I don't believe it is. In fact, that's not private information. According to the Supreme Court, those are business records of the telephone company. You don't go into that box of numbers, if you will, to look for connections unless you pick up someplace a suspicious number. You capture Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in Karachi or bin Laden in Abbottabad in Pakistan, and you look at their cell phones, you look at their Rolodex in effect and see what numbers there had connections back into the United States. And by preserving that database, you're able to come back and check and see if they've been talking with somebody inside. Now, as everybody who's been associated with the program said, if we had had this before 9/11, when there were two terrorists in San Diego, two hijackers, and been able to use that program, that capability against that target, we might well have been able to prevent 9/11. So we're not, the allegation is out there that somehow we've got, all this personal information on Aunt Fanny or Chris Wallace or whoever it might be, and we're pouring through it. Not true. That's not the way it works. It's been explained by Mike Hayden, who was involved in setting it up, by Keith Alexander, who's a superb guy, both of them, who's now running the program, that we have collected a lot of numbers, but they are business records of the phone companies. They have been determined by the Supreme Court not to be private individual records, the way they're oftentimes described by critics.
So let's assume that's right. Now the question is being asked, why does all of this have to be kept so secret? The terrorists clearly assume we're trying to intercept their phone calls and intercept their emails. So why not let the American public know the outlines, the general program, obviously not sources and methods and how you go in and the algorithms and all that, but the blueprint, the general outline of the program, so we as Americans can debate it?
Well, I have problems with respect to that concern. I understand people's concern about it, but an intelligence program that does reveal sources and methods, which in fact is what you're talking about, is significantly less effective because you're not just revealing it to the American people, you're revealing it to your targets, to your adversaries, to the enemy. There are reasons for secrecy in the conduct of intelligence operations. When we set this program up back in the weeks after '01, we briefed certain members of Congress, chairman and ranking member of the intelligence committees. We did it in my office in the West Wing. Mike Hayden had come in, George Tenet, I was there, and we'd give them the layout of what we were doing and what we were learning from it. Eventually, we did it for the elected leadership of the Congress, both parties, both houses. So we had senior officials in the Congress and eventually, obviously, the FISA courts who were read into the program and knew what we were doing and had, in effect, signed off on it. I once asked a collective group, the Big Nine, in the spring of '04, in the briefing. First, we briefed them and said, do you think we ought to continue the program? They said, absolutely yes. Then we said, do you think we ought to come back to the Congress and get additional legislative authorization? They said, absolutely not. It'll leak. Those were the senior leaders in the Congress at the time. Now,
so what right do you think the American people have to know what government is doing?
well, they get to, they get to vote for senior officials like the President of the United States or like the senior officials in Congress, and you have to have some trust in them. You don't go out when you're running an intelligence operation trying to collect data and, in effect, tell the enemy what you're doing. It would be a dumb idea. It makes the program significantly less effective, and it reveals to our adversaries crucial information that they shouldn't have.
All right, well, let me ask you about that, because top U.S. intelligence officials have released more information to try to explain and defend these programs. They released it Saturday, and let's put some of it up on the screen. They say data from these programs help break up terror plots in the U.S. and 20 other countries. Last year, they say fewer than 300 phone numbers were checked against the huge database, and that all the data is destroyed every 5 years. Given the leaks, given that information, do you think that provides useful information to our enemies?
Oh, I think it does. I mean, we've now laid out, they have no choice. I mean, I don't quarrel with what they're now putting out. They're forced to put it out because an individual, in this case Snowden, took it upon himself to decide the United States no longer needed to maintain this secret. You can't operate that way. It just doesn't function. I mean, if you think about what we were able to do in World War II, we're reading Ultra, the Germans' coded communications, vital in our success in that adventure. Could have announced it to the world. could have had this kind of debate, but obviously it would have destroyed the ability to collect it. You're telling your adversary about your sources and methods and how it is we're reading their mail. And the same thing is true here. What's different now is the threat. And the threat now isn't just overseas or just a foreign power. The threat now is terrorists coming back into the United States using deadlier weapons than ever before to launch an attack. We have to know what they're doing. We need to know who they're in contact with here in the United States. And what this program allows us to do, and the reason it was set up and the way it's been operated, was that when we went to Karachi and captured Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, we could get his Rolodex and see who he was talking to inside the United States. When you had the two guys in San Diego who were future hijackers on 9/11, they were in contact overseas with their leadership overseas, as well as some of the rest of the organization here in the States. If we'd been able to read their mail and intercept those communications and pick up from the calls overseas the numbers here that they were using in the United States, we would then probably have been able to thwart that attack.
Back when he was running for president in 2008, Barack Obama talked about what he called the false choice between liberty and security. And when this program was revealed last week, he said, well, I scrubbed a lot of what I inherited from you. Let's take a look.
I came in with a healthy skepticism about these programs. My team evaluated them. We scrubbed them thoroughly. We actually expanded some of the oversight, increased some of the safeguards.
How much has President Obama scrubbed what you guys gave him?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, I've not been in the loop on classified information since I left the White House. But I guess one of the keys for me, Chris, is I know Keith Alexander. He's one of the finest officers
Head of the National Security Agency.
Head of the National Security Agency, now in charge of the program. I know Mike Hayden very well. He was his predecessor. Mike later became CIA director. I worked with Mike Hayden when we set this program up. He came to me, and he and George Tenet, and we said that there were additional things we could gather if we had more authority. And then I took it to the president, and he signed off on it with some very strict limitations and restrictions on what we could do. These men are as fine officers as you're going to find any place in the United States military, and I've met a lot of them over the years. I trust these guys implicitly with my life.
So what do you make of...
What I make of what they're saying is they are to be believed. They're good, honest Americans. They're patriotic, but they also care very much about their responsibility to safeguard civil liberties.
But what I'm asking is, what do you make of the president suggesting, well, I had to scrub up what these guys left me?
I don't pay a lot of attention, frankly, to what Barack Obama says. I find a lot of it's in other areas, for example, IRS, Benghazi, not credible. I'm obviously not a fan of the incumbent president. I don't know what he did to the program. The program, obviously, from what's now been released, is still in operation. I think it's good that it's in operation. I think it has, in fact, saved lives and that kept us free from other attacks.